It's not enough to just rely on the fact that something has a CVE or it doesn't, because hostile actors are manufacturing their own vulnerabilities. They're actually getting into communities and inserting backdoors into systems that are incredibly important and are incredibly widely used. And so as we see this change, we have to fundamentally change the way we think about security and the way that we approach security, and we have to make those tools accessible to developers in a very practical and realistic way.
Hi, this is your Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Seattle, and we have with us once again Craig McLuckie, co-founder and CEO of Stacklok. Craig, it's great to have you back on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
But it has been a while since we sat down and talked. Of course, COVID happened. So I do want to know what you have been up to. Talk about this company that you created, when you created it, and why you felt need to create a new company.
Yeah, so by way of background, I've obviously been active in the open source ecosystem for quite some time. I was responsible for getting kind of Kubernetes going off the ground. I started the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So I guess you could say I've always had a soft spot for open source technologies. And the last company I built was fun, and I got an opportunity to work pretty closely with a lot of other great open source communities inside VMware, like the Spring community. And it really got me thinking about this world of open source technology. You've got what I think of as being like one of the great treasures of human innovation, which is open source technologies. If you look at things like, hey, we're all talking about generative AI all the time these days. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of open source involved. It's Linux for an operating system. It's Kubernetes as a workload management system. It's PyTorch and TensorFlow. It's Python. So there's a lot of open source that goes into this. And one of the things I've observed is that we consume an awful lot of open source, but we don't necessarily know where that open source is coming from. And as communities come under strain, it's going to become increasingly important that we think about the safety and sustainability of open source technologies that go into all of this amazing technology that the world's building. And so when it came time for me to think about my next journey, I really wanted to find a way to bring a community-centric way of thinking about open source security and sustainability to organizations large and small. And that's why I started Stacklok, as a way to help enterprise organizations and communities alike understand and secure their software supply chain.
Back in days when you're working on building Kubernetes, was security always back of your mind, or it's something that because the evolution of technology, you felt, hey, this is a big pain point that need to be addressed?
Well, I think security is always part of the landscape when you're building technologies, and you have to kind of live a little bit paranoid. But one of the things that I've been worried about for a while is just when you get a chance to see how open source communities work, and you understand that there's a lot of pressure on open source communities, and you have these relatively small communities that are disproportionately important to the well-being of the technology space at large, it also became clear to me that those communities are potentially vulnerable to certain classes of attacks. And I've often said that we're seeing the sea change, and it really started with SolarWinds, where hackers started behaving differently. These sophisticated nation-state sponsored hacking teams are no longer like burglars sneaking around your neighborhood looking for an open window. They're getting jobs at window manufacturers and making sure that every window that's made can be opened by a hostile actor, so they can kind of clean out the whole neighborhood in one evening. And so, as the world has transitioned, I'd been kind of thinking about this problem space for a while, and obviously with the sort of breaking of things like the XE vulnerability, it's become incredibly topical that the world needs something to help secure software consumption.
Also, what I like about security now versus old days was more or less like security is someone else's problem. It was less about security, it was more about insecurity. There was nothing you can do about it. Now it's, we talk about some of those foundational principles also, the whole DevSecOps, shift left movement, 0 days. So it's because when you talk about security, it's not that gloomy area. Actually, the way I look at sometime when I talk to folks like this, security enables teams. You build guardrails around them so they can play, they can innovate.
They can go faster.
Exactly.
You can go faster when you've got clear guardrails.
In early days, security teams will stop what you're doing because people won't want to talk to them. So can you also talk about, when you're talking about this change landscape, how security becomes an enabler as well?
It's interesting you say that, because I've seen the power of, people often look at things like constraints and they think that constraints slow them down. But often it's not. When you're a developer, if you're given the set of constraints and the constraints are just integrated into the environment that you work in, so you don't even notice them anymore. It's kind of like bowling with the bumpers up, you are definitely going to hit the pins. And it actually unlocks the productivity of teams by having all of those constraints just baked into their their IDE baked into the environment in which they work, they don't really notice them anymore, and they can execute with confidence and not have to worry about a bunch of rework where, something gets detected in the production environment, and then they have to figure out like how to kind of fix it after they've already qualified everything and got everything working. So I do think putting sec in sort of the DevSecOps kind of landscape is an important activity. And I think a community-centric way to do that is going to be really important.
Earlier, you're also talking about XZ vulnerability. Can you talk about how serious is that problem?
I think it's a pretty serious problem. So the XZ vulnerability is a sea change. It's a fundamentally different way of the way that hackers are behaving. And one of the things that's really complex about this is existing tools tend to be binary in terms of the way they approach things. So it's either good or bad. It has a known vulnerability or it doesn't. And if it doesn't have a known vulnerability, you're fine using it. But the reality is that there's a lot more intangible things that go into determining whether a piece of software is safe for consumption or not. And I think with the XZ vulnerability, what we're seeing now is a recognition that it's not enough to just rely on the fact that something has a CVE or it doesn't, because hostile actors are manufacturing their own vulnerabilities. They're actually getting into communities and inserting backdoors into systems that are incredibly important and are incredibly widely used. And so as we see this change, we have to fundamentally change the way we think about security and the way that we approach security. And we have to make those tools accessible to developers in a very practical and realistic way.
And what role do you see Stacklok is going to play in that world?
So I think there's two things that need to exist here. One is we need to generate high quality intelligence about open source software. So when you're looking at a piece of open source software, if you're part of a sophisticated community, you might have dependency maintainers. And those maintainers are going to have, their primary job is to look at the dependency set that you have, assess the sustainability of the ecosystems that are producing it, if necessary, deploy some of your resources to make sure that those things are being supported, and kind of go from there. Now that's great if you have this very mature organization, if you have this very mature community, but the reality is most open source projects don't have that luxury, they don't have those resources. And so we need to be able to bring them that intelligence in a way that's naturally accessible and easy to integrate into the day-to-day work. So that's the first thing that we're doing is we're actually building what we think of as an OSS trust graph. So we're looking at all of the packages out there, we're looking at all of the contributors, and we're working to understand the relationship between packages and contributors. We'll look and establish a baseline saying, hey, this is a reputable package based on all of these heuristics that we can see, and then start to kind of map the contributors into those packages and map the impact of those contributions back to the individual who's making them. So we build up this kind of complex graph which enables us to provide a very high quality insight for an individual who's assessing a piece of software and trying to decide, should I use this open source dependency or should I not? So that's the first thing we're doing. And the second thing we're doing is, well, it's great that you have all of this understanding and this information, but you need to be able to integrate that into your workflow as far left as possible and as naturally as possible so that developers are just making that a part of their everyday life. So the second thing that we've done is provided an open source platform that integrates all of that high quality signal intelligence into the day-to-day workflows of engineers. And we're making all of that available as free to use for the open source community. So we want to make sure that we start by supporting open source contributors and we make open source intrinsically safer and more sustainable to build and deliver.
I'll just change the topic slightly from security to open source, which is like in last couple of years, we have seen some disturbing trends. I don't want to go in details, companies changing the licenses, business models. You have been in open source, as you said, also in open source, very close to you. Are you worried about these trends? Or are you like, hey, we have seen this over years, so this is nothing to worry about. We will course correct ourselves. Or you see, hey, this is also a major problem that open source is facing today?
I'm really worried about it. And there's two things that kind of really bother me. One is like a lot of the people that are building open source, they're doing it for love, not for money, right? Like they're out there doing hard work. They're doing it, in their free time often as not. And what they're doing is actually moving and improving the human condition. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that. And the thing that really worries me around what we're seeing out there in the community across these two vectors, the XC vulnerability vector, which is likely to create a lot more paranoia and a lot more pressure in open source communities, and then that kind of licensing vector, which is creating a lot of distrust with open source, it's just creating drag and friction for that individual, for that contributor. And so I do see communities coming under duress. I do see communities coming under strain. And it worries me. And I think the call to action here, just from a person who's been pretty close to these projects, is one, vote with your wallet. If you're assessing a vendor and you're going to go buy software from a vendor, look at that vendor's pedigree and track record in terms of supporting and sustaining open source communities. And without naming names, I think you'll find that some vendors are very, very responsible, and they put an inordinate amount of resources into the open source community. Like, I'll just name two vendors that I think are exemplary in this regard, like Microsoft and Google. They do amazing work. They pour tremendous amounts of resource into the open source ecosystem. Vote with your wallet. That's a good place to start. And then the second thing I think is we do need to find ways as a community to identify those critical fracture points in the open source ecosystem, those points where it is that single committer based in Nebraska that's holding up the totality of the internet. And we need to bring them support. So shine a light on the fact that that situation is not sustainable, and find ways to help them with resources, with additional support, and draw the community's attention to those hotspots in the ecosystem. So those are two things that I think are going to be really important.
What is the importance of culture and practices also? Because tools sometimes cannot be enough. If you don't have that practice within the organization, if you don't have the culture.
Yeah.
And with security, it does become challenging,
Absolutely. And I think, it's funny you say that, because like the tools are actually taking us in the opposite direction in some ways. If you think about things like generative AI, it's enabling like new citizen coders to start producing things that they never thought were even possible before. So not only are the tools like not necessarily a delight for people to use, but the availability of these high productivity generative AI tools is actually creating new classes of problems where folks are just broadly unaware of what's happening in the space. And so I think education is going to be like absolutely critical. Like discipline is going to be critical. Like getting to the point where, as an organization's participating in this ecosystem, like, hey, is all your source code in a source repo? I know that sounds really mundane, that you have basically everything checked into a Git repo somewhere, but it's going to become incredibly important, particularly as citizen coders are starting to light up their own applications. So getting back to a lot of the fundamentals, really just focusing on the education, so that people get an awareness of some of the challenges here. Like there's some really scary people out there that are doing some really scary things with things like open source technologies. And I think citizen coders are going to get hurt. Even professional developers are going to get hurt if we can't raise their awareness and draw attention to this without creating that kind of McCarthyism where people are kind of paranoid and looking at everyone as if they're like a sort of Cold War spy. But we do need to drive that education.
And once again, Stacklok's role there, sometimes tools can also become a catalyst to bring that cultural change, because they kind of enforce that practice.
And if people start to identify with their tools, if they feel ownership of their tools, and this is why I think it's going to take a village. And when I think about our approach versus what we see out there in the broader ecosystem, I've had so much positive experience building in the open, building in a collaborative way, building in a situation where a vendor participating with you may be competitive in the market, but you recognize that by working together and collaborating on an open source project that's kind of neutrally grounded, is just going to create disproportionately better outcomes. And so certainly I think that the way that we're building in the open is an invitation to people to feel ownership of the tools, contribute to the tools that they're using on a daily basis. But it's also an invitation to other vendors to participate. We don't need this platform to be our platform. We need this platform to exist in the world so that we can create value and solve some real problems.
Any announcement that you folks made here?
Yeah, so we're making two announcements at the Open Source Summit North America. The first is the introduction of what we call the Open Source Software Trust Graph. So this is effectively using statistical methodologies and a new approach that we call a proof of diligence algorithm to effectively look at the relationship between contributors and the projects that they're contributing to, and to build up a view of open source software so that we're confident that it's being produced by people that have strong sort of experience in the industry. And we use that experience to kind of drive an awareness of the intrinsic safety and sustainability of a project. So that open source trust graph is a really interesting and novel piece of capability. And I think it's an important thing that the world needs as we start to see these classes of the XZ class of vulnerability starting to emerge. And then the second thing that we've introduced is what we call Minder Cloud. This is a framework which enables an open source community to apply policies to their GitHub repos. So you could, for instance, say things like, I want to make sure that all of the dependencies that I'm merging into my repo meet certain trust standards. So it basically can consume that information from the open source software trust graph, and then apply policies into your repos to make sure that you're staying within what you consider an acceptable risk threshold as an open source contributor.
Do you also work closely with foundations like Linux Foundation? Before you, I was talking to Hillary Carter, and they identify this problem, so they are setting up some portal where you can find all, because they have 20 different projects focused on security. It's hard to find which one is that. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we're currently in conversations with a lot of folks that are doing kind of open community-centric work. So. We're talking to folks on things like the Chaos Project. Orger is in a similar space, and they're doing some really interesting work. We're trying to figure out how we can support them. We're certainly having conversations with folks from like the OpenSSF and CNCF, trying to figure out how we can both bring these capabilities into some of these foundation contexts, but also figure out what the right long-term home is for technologies like Minder, because we do see this as a community-centric initiative, and we want to make sure that we're behaving as good and responsible community citizens.
What is your long-term plan for the company, number one? Number two is that it's 2024 April. What can we expect from this company this year?
The first answer is, well, I don't want to be that kind of guy who's always known for Kubernetes. So I'm hoping that whatever we build with Stacklok,
that's not a bad thing, but it's
yeah, I just don't want to be that that band that had the one hit in the 80s and they just keep singing that hit for at corporate functions for the rest of existence. So for me, I think it's this Stacklok and then the projects that we create. Like, I would like to see Stacklok be a catalyst for a transformation in how people think about securing software delivery. We don't have to own the space. I think there's more than enough opportunity for a lot of different players to step forward and contribute and own. Obviously, I want us to be very successful. I want us to be very competitive. But I think more importantly, I want to marshal in a new way of thinking about securing the software supply chain. For Stacklok, the company itself, look, I hope we go from strength to strength. I would love to see us become a publicly traded company that exists long past my time on Earth. But we're a startup. You can never tell. It's almost impossible. In terms of what you can expect from us, a lot more awesomeness in the open source space. We are going to continue to layer on capabilities into the Minder platform. So you'll see us going from being focused just on GitHub policy enforcement to adding things like OCI registries and Kubernetes providers and a few other things. So we want to really broaden it out. And you can also expect us to continue to drive high-value insight from trustees. So if you want to understand things about the open source that you're integrating into your environments, Trustee will provide those answers. And if you want to define policies that basically enforce your posture as you're delivering software, Minder will do that for you.
Right. When you look at security, it's a sticky field. You move there, but at the same time, it's a solved but unsolved. It's not a destination. It's a journey. It's a process.
That's right.
Good guys have to be right 101 time. Bad guys have to be right only once. Yep. So when we look at the bigger security, where do you see Stacklok there?
The thing that I would like to be known for here is, I think the CVE is a failing currency, right? So if you think about the way that the security industry works right now, it's all about known vulnerabilities. It's a vulnerability or it's not a vulnerability. It's a binary decision-making process. Something that doesn't have known vulnerabilities is good. Something that has them is bad. That's the way that the security world works. It feels fundamentally flawed to me because, one, the quality of CVEs is degrading over time. We've created some perverse incentives, so there's a lot of them, and the noise is overwhelming. The signal-to-noise ratio just isn't there. But increasingly, the absence of a CVE isn't telling you anything either. It could be because it's good, or it could also be because it's perfectly malicious. And so what I would like to do, certainly from a Stacklok perspective, is to bring this change in the way that people think about this. It's like, understand the sustainability of something. Something is sustainable if it fixes its CVEs, right? Like, that's just one market. But something's also sustainable if it has a good cross-section of developers. It is sustainable if it has a decent release cadence. It is sustainable if it's well-resourced and has a potentially commercial entity behind it. So bringing that sense of going from just security, good, bad, binary decisions to understanding the intrinsic sustainability and safety, not just the security posture of communities, is something that we want to bring to the world. And that's something that Stacklok's really committed to executing on.
One more constituent that play a big role when it comes to security is the public sector, the government entities. The recent Biden, they came up with a lot of, executive orders focused on security. Yeah. A lot of government entities, they come up with a lot of, regulations. how closely Stacklok will work with them?
First of all, we are obviously, look, we're a little rinky-dink startup. We've only been around for a year, so it's not like Joe calls me up in the evening and says, "Hey, Craig, what should I be doing about this thing?" So we'd like to get there at some point. But realistically, I think what we're seeing right now, and I think there's a really dangerous moment that we're about to enter, which is because, and it is our belief that things like XC had a nation state actor behind it. Because that nation state actor probably didn't just go after one, there's probably another 10 of those out there. And we just don't want to see this reflexive movement, which basically shuts down innovation and puts incredible pressure on open source communities. So I think that's one thing, which is making sure that the response is measured and appropriate. But the other thing is, Executive Order 14028 introduced the need for SBOMs, but we haven't seen all of the tooling that makes SBOM consumption useful. It feels like we've got regulation without the necessary supporting kind of information. And so, I would like to backfill some of those capabilities. I'd like to get to a point where we can make SBOMs actually useful. We have a system you can load them into, we'll watch it, we'll reason about whether dependencies are good or bad, we can deal with drift detection, etc. And as we start to look at the responses to things like this issue with the XE vulnerability, I hope to be a supplier of tools and capabilities that make whatever regulation comes down more palatable and actually enable it to create real value for both the communities that are supporting the world, but also for the people that are consuming the software that they're producing.
Craig, thank you so much for taking time out today, and of course talk about the company and the whole landscape. And I look forward to chat with you again soon. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks for your time.